So this is a demonstration of how to use the X method or the cross method to factor a quadratic whose leading coefficient is something other than 1. Just a note that if your quadratic has a greatest common factor, that does need to be factored out first and left just written as a leading coefficient for the answer. So I'll work an example like that in a second. But again, if you have a greatest common factor, you do need to factor that first. It will actually cancel out if you don't take care of that with this method. So here are the steps for the X method. This initial step of finding the product of A times C, the first term times the last term, is the same as the 6-step method. We simply are going to organize our answer differently. Once we find our product of AC, which is 14, we're going to write it in the top of the X. So our product AC goes up here. And then we're going to write B, the B term of 15, on the bottom of the X. So we have our two kind of goal numbers organized neatly here in the center of the X. We need to find two numbers who add to B, whose sum is B, and whose product is the AC that we found in step 1. So two numbers that would multiply to 14 and add to 15 are 14 and 1. So we're going to take those two numbers and write them on the sides of the X, the 14 and the 1, just one on each side. It doesn't matter which one goes where. Either one is fine, just on separate sides. So once we've written those numbers, our next step here is to divide by A, by our leading coefficient. So divide both of the sides by A, which in this case is 2, and then simplifying if necessary. For example, this 14 over 2 will become 7 over 1. Okay, and now that we have these numbers, these two fractions, they're going to give us the numbers that will go into the factors. We're going to write the denominator before the X. So the X is always the first term in the parentheses. So the denominator will be the coefficient of X, and the numerator will be the number after X, the second number in parentheses. So for this first one, 1X, denominator in front of X, and then the numerator after X plus 7. Since it's not negative, we don't need to write a minus. It just becomes a plus. For the second side, it would be 2X, denominator in front of X, plus 1, the numerator goes after 1. And if you double check this with the 6-step method, you do get the same solution. So again, this will work unless a greatest common factor is present. The way to handle a greatest common factor, for example, a problem like this, 8x squared minus 24x plus 18, this would have a greatest common factor of 2. And it is necessary to factor out the 2, simplify the problem, and then when we use the X method, we'll be using the A, B, and C of this simplified trinomial that we get here, and this should be a 12. Negative 12x in the middle. Let's get that back. Make this a negative 12x. And a plus 9. Okay, so now when you use the X method, you would just work with this here, and we'll just write the 2 in front of our answer, set up our parentheses, so we don't forget that GCF of 2 that was taken out. So 4 times 9 is 36. Our B term is negative 12, so we write it on the bottom. So we are looking for two numbers that multiply to 36 and add to negative 12. Since 36 is positive, our two terms need the same sign. Since their sum is negative, they must both be negative. So that's going to be negative 6 and negative 6. Divide by the leading coefficient, which is 4. Again, we're working with what's in the parentheses here because we factored out the 2. So divide both sides by 4 and reduce. They will both become negative 3/2. And so when we go to put those into our parentheses, remember the denominator goes in front of X and the numerator goes after. So 2X minus 3 and 2X minus 3, which could also be written as 2 parentheses 2X minus 3 quantity squared. One last note about this method, it can also be used for problems with a leading coefficient of 1, such as this example here. Here, when we multiply our leading coefficient of 1 and 12, we just get 12. Our middle term, our b, is 8. So two numbers that multiply to 12 and add to 8 are 2 and 6. And then when we do the step of dividing by the a term, since a is just 1, no simplification is necessary. And when we go to use these in the factors, it's just 1x plus 2, 1x plus 6, which is similar to the simple process of just finding two numbers that multiply to 12 and add to 8. We're doing the same thing, but you can use the x method to organize it. So that is the x method for factoring quadratics.